This is the Conscious Hour, Friday. Let's get some real information, not the stuff you don't see on mainstream Western media. This is Professor Marandi.
The Israeli regime carried out aggression against Iran. Every time Iran responded to aggression, the Israelis did it again. So now the Iranians feel that they have to make sure that the Israeli regime and its Western allies rethink their calculations. Because so far, every time Iran strikes, the Israelis show no regret and they go further. And in the last strike, the airstrike against Iran, which was a failure, I mean, it did cause some damage, but it was a failure. No doubt about that. There was no destruction of the nuclear program or some fake nuclear weapons program. Actually, the head of the IAEA said that in Parchin, contrary to what the Israeli regime was saying, is claiming that there is no Iranian nuclear program, civilian or otherwise. There were no secondary explosions anywhere in Iran for anyone to see. It was a failure. But despite that, in that attack, the Americans were deeply involved. The Americans assisted the Israeli regime all the way, in many ways. Despite that, the regime failed. So what the Iranians will be doing is they're going to strike so hard that that it forces the Israeli regime to change its calculations. Not Netanyahu. Netanyahu will not change his calculations. Because for Netanyahu, this is all about Netanyahu. This is not about even the interests of the regime. This is about preserving power. But Iran wants to make the regime change its calculations. But more important than the Israeli regime is the backers of the regime. The Israeli regime, we all know, would collapse utterly without daily Western support for this genocidal regime, whose leaders have been indicted, who have arrest warrants. Without their daily support, the regime would collapse. But Iran wants the calculations of the United States to change. So I think Iran will strike very hard not to teach the Israeli regime, not just to teach the Israeli regime a lesson, but also to force it to recalculate and to force its allies to rethink their policies. So I think Iran is going to, and Iran has every just reason to do so. They attacked Iran. They injured the Iranian ambassador in Lebanon in the Beeper terror attack. He was severely wounded, and he's just now recovering and going back to Lebanon. Just as many of the other victims, Lebanese victims, have recovered or recovering for the most part. So he's going back, but he was a victim of an assassination. That is going to be a part of the punishment. And then also, Iran will seek to strike the Israeli regime in a way which will push, will change calculations and thus push the regime towards accepting a ceasefire that's acceptable to the resistance.
We are witnessing right now that the Biden administration, in its final days in office in Washington, they're just giving the permission to the Ukrainian government to hit deep into the Russian soil. On the other hand, it seems that they're trying to make a deal in Lebanon. They send the Hochstein to Lebanon, who is an Israeli, who was serving for Israel in their military, and right now is the U.S. envoy to Lebanon to talk with them to make a deal, to cut a deal between Lebanese and Israelis. How do you see the way that the Biden administration is managing right now in the Middle East, in Lebanon especially?
Well, you know, and I'm sure many in your audience know, that the U.S. negotiator who's negotiating on behalf of the White House is an Israeli who served in the Israeli armed forces and in the subjugation of the Palestinian people he participated in. So this is the honest broker. This is the United States being an honest broker. And I think that this again shows that the United States is not in touch with it. It's detached from reality. The Americans and Israelis are not going to get from Lebanon, through negotiations, what they're unable to achieve on the battlefield. And all of these escalations that we've been seeing over the past few weeks, they are all to undermine Trump. So Biden is taking big risks, and so are his European allies, in order to tie the hands of Trump. Trump needs peace because the U.S. economy is in a terrible state, and it's going to get a lot worse pretty soon. But also, he's going to be at war with the deep state. And so then the Biden regime and the allies of the Biden regime across NATO, they want to create problems for Trump so that when he comes in, his hands are tied, as I said. So the ridiculous accusation of Iran attempting to assassinate Trump, that's where it comes from. The escalation with Ukraine, the sudden rush to send in the rest of the aid allocated by Congress to Ukraine before January the 20th, you have to look at it within that context. The usage of longer range missiles in the ATACMS system, which is manned by American soldiers, we have to see it within that context. And the Americans are waging war now against Russia because American soldiers are now directly involved. We have to see that within this context. And of course, the censure of Iran at the International Atomic Energy Agency that is imminent, we have to see it within that context. They are escalating across the board to make sure Trump has his hands are tied when it comes to foreign policy, and that makes it all the more difficult for him to deal with the FBI, to deal with the CIA, to deal with the national security establishment and the deep state and the economy. They're setting him up for failure. That's what he's not the good guy. They're all the same, but they're hostile towards one another. So we have to see this all within this context. And interestingly, the Americans and their allies, they're escalating with Russia and the Iranians and the resistance at the same time. And it only makes it more difficult for them. They're overstretched as it is. And now they're pushing the Russians to react more harshly, which they have to do. Because, Nima, one thing that I think is lost upon many people is that whenever a country tries to deal with the West in good faith, the West slaps them in the face. Iran's nuclear deal was seen, what the Iranian side was showing goodwill. The Western side, instead of seeing this as goodwill, they saw it as a sign of Iranian weakness. And they took advantage of Iran. Immediately, Obama began violating the deal. And then Trump tore up the deal. The Minsk Accords, then the Istanbul negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. All of these show that the West is incapable of signing a deal and abiding by it. They are unreliable. And so so Iran cannot repeat history anymore. Iran cannot sign another JCPOA because they know that the West is going to betray it. It's going to be much harder for Iran to ever negotiate with the West again under these regimes. The same is true with the Russians. So the Russians are going to have to be firm with the West to be taken seriously, so that the West, because if the Russians show goodwill, the West will take advantage of it. They'll see it as a sign of weakness. They won't see this as goodwill. Right now, look what the Europeans are doing. They've invited a very horrible terror organization that fought for Saddam Hussein against Iran, that murdered 17,000 people in Iran, the MEK terror organization, which is a cult. They invited them to the European Parliament. Or just today, we saw over 100 people slaughtered in Pakistan by extremists. We know these extremists, these Takfiri extremists, where their funding comes from. The terror attacks that they carry out in Iran, in Pakistan, and elsewhere, in Syria. All of these have been creations of Western intelligence agencies. In Russia, how come none of these horrific attacks take place in Europe or North America? They all happen in Iran or Russia or Pakistan.
It's real simple, because the military-industrial complex, which is the Western hegemony, actually controlled by the Jews, because they control our country. It's the military-industrial complex. It's about profits. That's why we have this big problem in America. Our money's going overseas. We're paying all these taxes, and all they're doing is making more profits, making less profits for us in America, meaning we're starving and having a hard time even surviving. All prices of everything's going sky high, and yet we keep funding the military. And that's the true sign of insanity.